Hi everyone, can you hear me? Yeah. It's lovely to be here, and thanks for all the fascinating talks so far. I think there's been a beautiful flow and enmeshment of all these conversations, which also link very much to what I'll be presenting here today. I always feel a little bit embarrassed because this is not actually my own work, but I'm presenting it on behalf of a very big group of people who made input to this, and I'll refer to all of them as I go along. I'm Professor Martine Visser. I'm from the School of Economics and also Director of the Environmental Policy Research Unit at UCT. So just to give you a bit of background about this study, the first phase is based on a study that was done in 2022-23 by the African French Development Bank in collaboration with DFFE and SANBI. The title is quite a mouthful. It says Assessment of Socioeconomic and Financial Risks and Opportunities Associated with Ecosystem Service Degradation and Changes in Regulations, Consumer Preferences, and Technological Innovations. Now, the reason why I color-coded it like that was actually to show that there is a reason why they chose such a long title. And I'm going to be referring to that in the talk again. So if I can maybe just get you to get your head around this right now, then the rest of the talk will flow very smoothly. So what that title is really saying is there's two types of risk, environmental related risk that we face. If we want to see what bad things happening to the environment, what can the impact of that be on the economy, then we're talking about ecosystems, services-related risks. And if we're talking about trying to do good things to make bad things that happens to the environment better, then we're talking about transition-type risks. And that's a kind of regulations that we're trying to impose to target things like climate change or flooding, etc. So the whole study is sort of based on that premise that we're trying to assess what are the impacts of these potential risks and opportunities that we face that impact the environment and then subsequently impact the economy and socioeconomic indicators. And so we've been tasked in the second phase to create a body of knowledge products to support the mainstreaming of biodiversity in South Africa's finance and business sector. But really we've looked at it across the sectors of business, agriculture, water, finance, banking, and FDIs. So we were tasked to write a synthesis report which is more targeted at users with policy relevant issues in mind. We created a slide deck out of that, 2 fact sheets that you've seen here, and we are now in the process of developing 5 policy briefs. And this is important to mention because our breakaway sessions today, which will be a breakaway session for the water sector, the business sectors, banking, FDIs, and then for agriculture and forestry, is really there to help elicit your thoughts and information about the policy relevance of this work and how we can bring this back into this body of work. So please keep that in mind when you listen to the talk. So just a moment to talk about the status of natural capital in the world and also in South Africa, but we've said quite a lot about that already so far, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But if you look at the state of produced capital since 1992, it's basically increased by more than 100%. Human capital has grown by more than 14%, but natural capital has declined by almost 40%. And then in South Africa, as many of the speakers here have mentioned, is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, and I heard some really amazing things yesterday about 2% of the land is covered by South Africa, but in terms of species diversity with plants, we own 10% of the diversity, and with animals, I think it was 7%, and marine life 15%. Those were actually new figures for me, and it's really exciting to know that. But half of the 1,022 ecosystems within South Africa are considered threatened. with 12 and 14 of animal and plant species being threatened respectively. And one of the key reasons why we also here is what is the implications of that for the economy, and understanding what does it mean and why we would want to mainstream biodiversity for the rest of the economy. And one of those reasons are also that biodiversity drives employment, and the destruction of ecosystem services and what they provide for South Africa could result in economic failure. So just to sort of cap the aims of this project is really to try and understand nature-related risks and opportunities in South Africa. We've gathered expert input in the first phase and also now in the second phase from experts, stakeholders in DFFE, National Treasury, the Reserve Bank, WWF, Conservation South Africa. So it's been a rich process, but today with your input, we hope to make it even richer. And what this study does is it integrates data sets to model nature-related risk and opportunities and the effects on socioeconomic and financial risks using three bodies of data. The first being resource-related modules, then input-output data, which a lot of you are familiar with. People from Stats SA and the Reserve Bank use that regularly, and then also socioeconomic data. And the idea is that with this work, we want to aid decision makers with practical tools to implement biodiversity mainstreaming, which then helps sectors to support and to support sectors to integrate biodiversity and also facilitate policy dialogues about this. So this is what I was referring to earlier. The two main concepts that we want to explain in order to understand this body of work. And firstly, that this work identifies physical risks and transition risks, where physical risk is basically shocks to the environment. So that could be a drought or a flood, and that has an impact on a sector such as farms, crops being destroyed, and those farmers may over time not be able to make a living anymore, but that has impacts on the rest of the economy, the sectors that makes input to farming, and also the sectors that produce products from farming, and subsequently all the people and households involved in terms of wages, income, taxes, etc. Then transition shocks is the one that's a bit more difficult to get one's head around. These are related to changes in consumer preferences as people become more aware. They don't want to use plastic straws anymore, so they change their behavior. It can also be regulatory changes when you try to target climate change, or people throwing plastic in the environment. And it can also be technology change, so as people switch from coal-based energy to renewables. When we make those changes, that has at least short to medium-term impacts on the economy as well, where those sectors which are now being targeted are actually facing a period where there may be losses, job losses, closures of firms, etc. And so this is what we refer to as transition risks. So in terms of the methods of the study, it explores how nature-related risks influence economic activities and the related socioeconomic impacts, with there being your nature-related risk being either a physical shock on the environment, or, as we said, it could be due to a transition shock. This is your economic activity in the economy, and that has subsequent impact on socioeconomic indicators, such as wages, employment, taxes, foreign revenue. Another very important part of the study is that it brings in the spatial component, which makes the study much richer. So here's an example, for instance, where we looked at surface water. And so what it provides is a spatially explicit analysis that determine how likely is it that nature-related risks, how likely they are, so the likelihood of a shock, this is the risk component, and then also to try and understand which sectors is likely to be affected. So what is the exposure within the economy, And by putting that together, we can come up with a vulnerability index. So when you look at that graph over there, we see there's 113 municipalities that's been identified, occurring mostly in the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal and Limpopo. And they are very sensitive to water shortages. But then what we want to understand is also what percentage of the production is dependent on surface water. And that allows us to then overlay these two parts of the information to look at the water dependence of production output of municipalities and say, what are their vulnerability to water shortages? And that then allows us to identify Mpumalanga, Eastern Cape, Limpopo, and the Free State as being the most vulnerable specifically to water shortages. In terms of the data, there's actually been quite a few speakers here who's been talking about the different parts. Here's the NCA core data that Thomas spoke about earlier. And so in terms of the natural resource modules, there's the Encore data, SANBI's BGIS data, the Embryo environmental satellite accounts, and also the WWF's water risk filter. Then in terms of the economic activities data, we have the input-output linkages data, the Embryo data, Quantec easy data, the regional data from Quantec. And then also in terms of the socioeconomic data, we have annual financial statistics, socioeconomic satellite accounts, and the Reserve Bank's financial holdings. So often when we talk about input-output modeling, most people glaze over. It's become much easier now for the rest of us that we just kind of open our laptop, pull up ChatGPT, and we say, so what will happen if we shock the economy by there's major floods in different provinces of South Africa, Natal specifically, what will happen to the economy and what will happen to employment and wages? And out pops a number, right? So in the background, we know there's a lot of algorithms going on, but we don't have to worry about it because it is solving it for us. Well, those modelers used to do that with input-output modeling. And so what they do is we have the intermediate goods sectors of the economy where the trade occurs, exchange of goods and services. There's the value-added components, and then there's the socioeconomic final demand components. And so we can ask these kind of questions where we say, well, what happens if there's a shock to something like agriculture? How does that impact other sectors in the economy, and what is its final impact on final demand? And in this case, when we're dealing with resource-related modules, we can then start asking questions about what is the impact of ecological shocks on the rest of the economy and on final demand. Are you ready to stop me already? I get 5 extra minutes because we're using some of the breakaway session time for that. So just in terms of a brief overview where I'm not going to spend time, is the study then focus on these physical risks, looking at direct and indirect exposures. We do a case study on pollination, which I'll show you quickly. We look at some spatial assessments, such as the surface water example. We consider transition risks, specifically with a case study of the coke oven production, where coke is a side product in the coal mining production for electricity. And then there again we look at the direct, indirect, and indirect demand and supply effects. And there's another spatial assessment for about mining and vegetation. And then lastly, we also do a case study around the banking sector, looking at both physical and transition risks. And what the paper has quite interesting sort of heat maps, which maybe is not so easy to follow right now, but what it does is presents different ecological ecosystem services and then your different sectors in the economy. And it shows, I mean, the heat map shows you where it's red, you have high sensitivity to those ecosystems. So you can see that the agricultural sector is sensitive to almost all of those ecosystem services. On the other hand, you can see that the ecosystems related to water, groundwater, surface water, flood management, so on, seems to impact a lot, almost all of the other sectors. And similarly, with indirect exposure, for instance, to agricultural shocks, you can see that a huge part of the manufacturing sectors and utility sectors are being impacted. So this pollination study, what it does is it shows you that if there's a shock to pollination, that impacts agriculture, again, that in terms of the socioeconomic indicators, it has impact on exports and employment wages, which might seem minimal, but there's indirect demand industries that's impacted by that shock, and they are dependent or impacted by household demand, exports, employment and wages as a result of that. And similarly, on the supply side, there's indirect effects through the impact on manufacturing, which then again has impact on production, profits, exports, employment and wages, and household demand again. And then also the hospitality sector is impacted subsequently as a secondary indirect supply effect, and there's an impact on employment and wages. What we see is that indirect supply shocks significantly impact supply of raw materials to manufacturing sectors, with over 60% of inputs for alcohol, cereal, food, pig raising coming from those sectors. I'm going to skip the coke oven production one. You can look at the report to see more about that. And then here's, for instance, I told you about the spatial assessments earlier. And here we can look at the sensitivity of vegetation to mining pressure and what happens when we overlap that with the production of mining value. And you can see basically that while we have sensitive vegetation areas in 10 different vegetation types in those municipalities, when we overlay them with areas where there's high density of mining production, the story looks different. So in terms of key findings from the study is, overall, there's a significant portion of the economy that depends on ecosystem services, with greater than 30% of production depending on water supply, quality of water, flow regulation, and flood and storm protection. 20 to 30% of the economy depends on climate regulation and erosion prevention. And then there's also the dependence on and risk to sectors that varies. So mining and manufacturing heavily depend on both physical risks, so specifically to water, and also transition risks in terms of the regulatory changes aimed at reducing environmental impacts. The risk to the socioeconomic indicators also varies, but the two that's most impacted are exports, being highly vulnerable to physical and transition shocks, which could severely affect South Africa's export capacity, and then also household consumption, with sectors supplying goods to households being particularly at risk to physical and transition shocks, which can again lead to price inflation for consumer goods. And the other part of the study, which focused on the spatial dynamic, tells us that the impact of physical and transition shocks on sectors varies spatially, with some areas facing more significant economic and social consequences. And so in the last part of the study, what we do is try and draw out some policy relevant themes to try and understand what is the implications of what this work presents us to different sectors. But really what we want to do is use these breakaway sessions to get your input about what you think the relevance are to your sector, and think specifically on policies that you think that might be relevant, and also just how those themes, we try to come up with three main themes, the one around sustainable practices and sustainable management, the other being around resilience, and the last one about different regulatory interventions or frameworks, and try to think how those in your sector are relevant to this work and vice versa. And we will use that input to enrich this body of work, to incorporate it into the policy briefs, and we'll distribute it widely so that you all will have access to it afterwards. Thank you very much. So Justine Necker, who's going to facilitate one of the breakaway sessions with me, and Roderick will come and tell you a little bit more about what's going to happen in the sessions. Roderick, don't you want to just stand up so people, or wave so that people can see you? There we go. And this is Justine.
Sorry, I'm just jumping in front of Justine, just to note, those that want to go to the water sector breakaway, you will stay behind here in the auditorium. Those that want to go to the finance and business sector, you will go to training room 9. There are people outside that will show you the way. And those that go to the agriculture and forestry, you will go to training room 13, which is also in the second wing ground floor. But like I say, Stats SA people are standing outside to direct you to the correct places. Thank you.
Yes, I'm skipping the pointer for this part. So thanks very much to everybody for listening to that input from our team side. The next section is really about us gathering insights and inputs from yourselves, really using the brains that we have in the room to start to enrich those policy briefs, as Martine's explained. The approach to the breakaway is very simply, we don't have very much time, we've got an hour. So during the session, really what we're going to do is it's going to just be a brief introduction. Martine has already mentioned that we will be giving you very brief input in terms of each of those areas, or the sector areas, relating to those 3 themes. So we'll sort of kick-start each theme, and then we're going to start to gather information from yourselves, really around those questions in terms of what are the policies that are potentially or relevant in relation to your sector, and the policy relevance in that context. A facilitated conversation, and then a brief summary within those breakaways. After the session, we are going to ask a few people within the various breakaways to think through what insights are coming up for them and to feed that back into the plenary. So if you're one of those people that are requested kindly to provide your input, please could you assist with that process as well. So really just providing insights or reflections from the discussion. And I think, yeah, just to request that people join the discussion that's of greatest relevance to the sector that they're in. We're obviously wanting to gather inputs from you in terms of your areas of expertise. Just in terms of the role players for the breakaways, you've already heard, so Martine's going to be taking the water breakaway. That's going to be here in the auditorium. So everybody who's focused on the water sector, if you could please stay here. That'll be with Jen, providing resource input, and we do have people who will be taking notes and assisting with that process. From a finance, business and DFI perspective, so development funding institutions, we've put them all together. Those will be in room 9 with Amy and Kadzeni providing support. And then breakaway 3 is agriculture and forestry. So if we can ask people from the agriculture and forestry side to go to room 13, as Rian had mentioned. And for both of those external rooms, if you go up through the stairs, out into the foyer, and basically you need to turn left before the set of stairs that go all the way up. As Rian has said already, there will be people there to guide us through the process. So that's really it. It's an hour, not a very long conversation, and then we break for lunch. When we come back from lunch, we're going to take a brief input on the conversation. But I think what's really important to note is that the inputs that you provide during those sessions will be used from Martine and my side, and Jane from Anchor, Jane Turpie, to pull together a set of policy briefs that will support SANBI and AFD and others in this process going forward. Thank you very much. Yep.
Thank you very much, Justine, for explaining the breakaway session, and thank you very much for your audience.